Water dripped from 3-foot icicles hanging off Hiram Cutler's cabin roof, while snow still blanketed the ground around him, but inside, he could work in his shirt sleeves while other trappers shivered beneath their furs. What he had done to that roof had seemed like madness 6 months earlier, but now, in the winter of 1842, it was saving his life in ways the men gathered outside were only beginning to understand. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. Ezekiel Stroud stood 15 feet from Hiram's cabin door, arms crossed, watching water stream off the eaves in steady rivulets, despite the fact that the temperature hadn't risen above 20 degrees in 4 days. The icicles were enormous, some reaching nearly to the snow-covered ground, and they caught the weak January sunlight like glass spears. But what held Ezekiel's attention wasn't the ice itself. It was the fact that the water was flowing at all. Inside that cabin, something was generating enough heat to melt ice on the exterior roof surface, even as the surrounding forest remained locked in deep winter cold. Hiram stood near his woodpile, watching the other trappers examine his handiwork with expressions that ranged from confusion to reluctant admiration. 6 men had made the journey to his remote claim specifically to see what Ezekiel had been talking about at the trading post. The tallow roof, the madman's experiment, the waste of good fat that should have been used for candles or sold for profit. They had come expecting to mock, but now they stood silent, studying the evidence that contradicted everything they understood about frontier construction. Abner Whitlock approached the nearest icicle and touched it carefully, feeling the water running down its length. He looked up at the roof itself, at the thick, matted surface that seemed to shimmer slightly in the cold air. The material was unlike anything used in standard cabin construction. It appeared almost organic, layered and dense, with a texture that suggested it had been built up gradually rather than assembled all at once. The color was difficult to describe. Not quite brown, not quite gray, but something in between, darkened by weathering and use. Ransom Blackwood circled the entire structure, examining it from all sides. The icicles were consistent all the way around, proof that heat was escaping uniformly rather than from specific weak points. That detail mattered. A standard cabin leaked heat through gaps in the chinking, through poorly fitted doors and windows, through thin spots in bark roofing. Those cabins created uneven icicle patterns or no icicles at all because the heat escaped too quickly to melt surface ice. This cabin was different. The heat was escaping slowly, consistently, through the roof material itself, which meant the interior was holding temperature far more effectively than conventional construction. Hiram had not spoken since the men arrived. He simply stood near his door, hands in his pockets, waiting. He had learned over the past months that words meant nothing compared to observable evidence. Let them look. Let them touch. Let them see the water flowing and feel the warmth radiating from the cabin walls. The numbers told the story better than he ever could. Outside temperature was 19 degrees. Inside his cabin, with a modest fire burning, the temperature held steady at 62 degrees. That 43-degree difference was unheard of in frontier construction. Standard cabins with similar fires might achieve a 30-degree difference at best, and that only when the fire was burning hot and fresh wood had just been added. Hiram Cutler had built his first cabin in the spring of 1839, 3 months after marrying Temperance Marsh at her father's trading post near the Missouri River. The structure was typical of what trappers built when they claimed a piece of wilderness for themselves. Logs cut from nearby pines, notched at the corners, stacked horizontally with moss and mud packed between the gaps. The roof was bark slabs laid over pole rafters, weighted down with stones to prevent wind from tearing them loose. It took Hiram and Ephraim Parnell 6 days to complete the basic structure, another 2 to build a crude fireplace from river stones and clay. Temperance had arrived at the cabin in late May, carrying her belongings in 2 canvas bags and a wooden trunk her father had given her as a wedding gift. She never complained about the roughness of frontier life or the isolation of living miles from the nearest neighbor. She planted a small garden in the cleared space behind the cabin, kept the interior clean despite the dirt floor, and learned to cure hides and render tallow from the deer and elk Hiram brought back from his hunting expeditions. They were building a life together in country that killed the unprepared with casual efficiency. The first 2 winters had been manageable. Cold, certainly, with temperatures dropping well below zero during the worst stretches, but survivable. The cabin kept out the wind. The fireplace provided heat when fed constantly. Hiram and Temperance slept under heavy furs and wore multiple layers of clothing indoors during the coldest months. They accepted this as normal. Every trapper and settler they knew lived the same way. Winter meant endurance. You burned through your wood supply, rationed your food, and waited for spring. But the winter of 1840 to 1841 was different. The cold came earlier and stayed longer. By mid-November, the temperature had already dropped to levels usually not seen until January. Snow fell in heavy storms that left drifts 4 feet deep around the cabin. The wind was relentless, finding every gap in the walls and driving cold air into the interior no matter how much mud and moss Hiram packed into the chinking. The fireplace consumed wood at an alarming rate, and even with a fire burning constantly, the cabin never felt truly warm. Temperance developed a cough in December. Nothing serious at first, just a persistent irritation that she attributed to smoke from the fireplace. But the cough didn't go away. It worsened gradually through the weeks, and by early January, she was spending most of her time near the fire, wrapped in furs, trying to stay warm enough to stop shivering. Hiram noticed she was eating less, sleeping poorly, and moving with a slowness that suggested exhaustion. He attributed it to the harsh winter, to the constant cold, to the grinding difficulty of simply staying alive in conditions that tested even the strongest constitutions. He didn't yet understand that the cabin itself was slowly killing her. The freezing rain started on January 12, 1841, arriving with a temperature just warm enough to turn snow into sleet. The sound on the bark roof was constant, a rattling percussion that made conversation inside the cabin difficult. Hiram fed the fire and checked the interior for leaks, finding only minor dripping in one corner where the bark had shifted slightly. He placed a wooden bucket beneath the drip and considered the problem manageable. By morning, the temperature would drop again, the rain would turn back to snow, and the leak would freeze shut until spring thaw. But the temperature didn't drop. Instead, the freezing rain continued through the night and into the next day. The bark slabs on the roof, already old and beginning to deteriorate after 2 years of exposure, began to fail under the weight of accumulated ice. The stones holding the bark in place were inadequate for the load. Around midday on January 13th, Hiram heard a cracking sound from above. He looked up just as a section of bark near the ridgeline shifted, creating a gap that immediately began pouring icy water into the cabin interior. He grabbed poles and tried to push the bark back into position from inside, but the ice weight made it impossible to move. More sections began failing as the water found weaknesses in the deteriorated material. Within an hour, the cabin had multiple leaks, some dripping, others flowing in steady streams. The dirt floor turned to mud, the bedding got soaked. The fire struggled to stay lit as water found its way down into the fireplace. Everything inside the cabin became wet and cold. Temperance sat huddled near the struggling fire, coughing continuously now, shivering despite the furs wrapped around her shoulders. Hiram worked frantically to contain the water, moving their supplies to the driest corner, trying to protect what food stores they had from the deluge. But there was no way to stop it. The roof was failing comprehensively, and there was nothing he could do from inside the cabin except endure it. The freezing rain finally stopped on the morning of January 14th, and the temperature dropped as Hiram had originally expected. The leaks froze, but the damage was done. The cabin interior was soaked. Their bedding was drenched and already beginning to freeze into stiff, unusable masses. The temperature inside the cabin, normally kept marginally comfortable by the fire, plummeted as the wet surfaces pulled heat from the air. Even with the fire rebuilt and burning strongly, the interior felt colder than it had before the rain, because everything was wet. Wet logs, wet floor, wet furs, wet clothing, and Temperance, sitting near the fire with her cough now accompanied by shivers she couldn't control, her face flushed with fever. Temperance's fever spiked on the third day after the roof failure. Hiram had managed to dry some of their bedding by hanging it near the fire constantly, rotating the furs and blankets to expose different sections to the heat. He had patched the worst of the roof leaks, using spare bark and additional stones, though he knew the repairs were temporary and inadequate. The cabin was functional again, but the cold had settled into everything. The log walls seemed to radiate chill. The dirt floor remained partially frozen despite the fire, and Temperance couldn't get warm no matter how close she sat to the flames. Her cough had changed quality, becoming deeper and more productive. She was bringing up phlegm now, sometimes tinged with blood. She ate almost nothing, claiming she had no appetite, and even drinking water seemed to cause her pain. Hiram recognized pneumonia. He had seen it kill trappers before, usually older men or those already weakened by injury or poor nutrition. But Temperance was young and had been healthy before the roof failed. He believed she would recover if he could just keep her warm and fed. He rode to Obadiah Marsh's trading post, a brutal 6-hour journey through deep snow, to get supplies and ask for help. Obadiah was Temperance's father, and when Hiram described her condition, the older man's face went grave. Obadiah gave him willow bark for the fever, dried herbs that might help with the cough, and whiskey to ease her pain. He also gave advice that Hiram already knew but didn't want to hear. Keep her warm, keep her dry, keep her eating if possible, and pray, because pneumonia in winter was often a death sentence. The return journey took longer because Hiram carried additional supplies. When he arrived back at the cabin near midnight, he found Temperance asleep near the fire, her breathing labored and rattling. Over the next 10 days he tried everything he knew. He kept the fire burning constantly, going through their wood supply at an unsustainable rate. He brewed the herbs Obadiah had given him and coaxed Temperance to drink them. He applied warm compresses to her chest. He wrapped her in every dry fur they owned, but her condition continued to deteriorate. The fever wouldn't break. The cough grew worse. Her breathing became increasingly difficult, each breath clearly requiring effort. On the 14th day after the roof failed, Temperance died. It was early morning, just after dawn. Hiram had fallen asleep sitting beside her, exhausted from 2 weeks of constant care. He woke to find her still and cold, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for days. The struggle was over. She was 23 years old. The ground was frozen solid to a depth of 18 inches, making burial impossible using conventional methods. Hiram spent 2 days building fires on the hillside he had selected, letting the flames burn down to coals, then scraping away the thawed earth and repeating the process. The work was mechanical, requiring no thought, which suited his state of mind. He did not want to think. He wanted to dig, to build fires, to move his body until exhaustion made everything else disappear. By the evening of the second day, he had excavated a grave deep enough to protect Temperance's body from scavengers. He wrapped her in their best furs and laid her in the frozen earth on January 29, 1841. Ephraim Parnell attended the burial, having arrived the previous day after hearing about Temperance's death from a trapper passing through the area. Obadiah Marsh came as well, making the long journey from his trading post despite the dangerous winter conditions. The 3 men stood on the hillside in temperatures well below zero, while Ephraim read from a Bible he had carried in his pack. The words were familiar, meant to provide comfort, but Hiram heard them as distant sounds with no particular meaning. They filled the grave with the excavated earth, now broken into frozen chunks that made hollow sounds as they fell. Hiram placed stones over the mound, large river rocks he had gathered from the creek bed where ice had exposed them. The stones would mark the location and provide weight to discourage animals. When the work was finished, Obadiah asked if Hiram wanted to return to the trading post for the remainder of winter. The offer was practical and well-intended. A man alone in a remote cabin with nothing but grief and memory was in danger of losing himself to darkness. Hiram declined. He thanked Obadiah for coming, thanked Ephraim for the service, and watched them leave the next morning. Then he returned to the cabin that had killed his wife and sat near the fire, looking at the patched sections of roof that still showed stains from the water that had poured through. He understood with absolute clarity that Temperance had died because the shelter he provided was inadequate. The cabin had failed during the freezing rain, and that failure had created conditions that led directly to her pneumonia and death. Other factors had contributed: the severity of the winter, the distance from medical help, the limitations of frontier medicine, but the root cause was the roof. If it had held, if it had kept the interior dry, if it had provided adequate insulation and protection, Temperance would still be alive. That understanding became an obsession. Hiram could not bring Temperance back, but he could ensure that no one else died the same way she had. He could build a roof that would never fail, that would keep out water completely, that would hold heat efficiently enough to create a truly warm interior, even in the worst winter conditions. He did not know yet how to accomplish this, but he knew with certainty that he would figure it out or die trying. The alternative, accepting that frontier cabins were simply inadequate and deaths like Temperance's were inevitable, was intolerable. Hiram spent the remainder of that winter visiting every cabin, shelter, and structure within a 3-day ride of his claim. He traveled through brutal cold and deep snow with a singular focus that bordered on compulsion. He was not socializing or trading. He was studying construction, specifically roofs, and cataloging how they failed. Most trappers thought his behavior was evidence of grief-driven madness, and perhaps they were correct, but Hiram did not care about their opinions. He cared about understanding exactly why frontier roofs were inadequate. The most common roof type was bark slabs over pole rafters, identical to what Hiram himself had built. The construction was fast and used readily available materials, which explained its popularity, but the failures were systematic and predictable. Bark deteriorated quickly when exposed to weather, becoming brittle and cracking within 2 to 3 years. The slabs warped as they dried, creating gaps that let in water and wind. The weight-bearing capacity was limited, meaning heavy snow loads could collapse the entire structure. And critically, bark provided almost no insulation value. Heat from interior fires passed directly through the thin material, wasting fuel and leaving occupants cold. The second most common type was split log shingles overlapped like scales. This construction was more labor-intensive but more durable than bark. The shingles could last 5 to 7 years before needing replacement, and they shed water more effectively than bark slabs. But they still provided minimal insulation, and they were vulnerable to wind damage. Hiram found multiple cabins where storms had torn away sections of shingles, leaving the interior exposed until repairs could be made. The gaps between shingles also created pathways for driven rain and snow to penetrate, causing interior leaks during severe weather. Sod roofs were less common but present in areas where trees were scarce. These roofs consisted of layers of prairie sod stacked on pole frameworks, sometimes 2 feet thick. They provided excellent insulation and were essentially fireproof, but they had critical weaknesses. The weight was enormous, requiring robust wall construction to support it. The sod retained moisture, which led to rotting of the underlying wood structure, and in heavy rains, sod roofs could become waterlogged and collapse catastrophically. Hiram examined one abandoned cabin where the roof had failed exactly this way, crushing the interior and making the structure completely unusable. A few cabins used canvas tarps coated with pine pitch as waterproofing layers beneath bark or shingles. This was closer to a functional solution, but the canvas deteriorated from sun exposure and the pitch became brittle in extreme cold, cracking and losing its waterproof properties within a single season. The approach showed that trappers understood the need for waterproofing, but they lacked materials that could withstand frontier conditions long-term. Hiram cataloged these failures methodically, noting specific problems and thinking through potential solutions. The ideal roof needed to be waterproof completely, not just water-resistant. It needed to provide substantial insulation to retain interior heat. It needed to be durable enough to last years without major maintenance. It needed to withstand heavy snow loads without structural failure. And it needed to be buildable using materials available to a lone trapper without access to expensive manufactured goods. No existing frontier roof design met all these requirements, which meant Hiram would have to invent something new. The idea came to Hiram in early March, not through deliberate reasoning, but through simple observation of an object he handled every day. He was checking his trap lines along the creek when rain began falling, cold and steady. He reached for his leather possibles bag, the small pouch he carried containing fire-starting materials, spare lead balls, and other essential items. The bag was made from deer hide he had tanned himself the previous fall, and he had treated the leather with rendered tallow to waterproof it, a standard practice among trappers for preserving leather goods. As rain struck the bag's surface, Hiram watched the water bead up and roll off without penetrating. He had seen this effect countless times before without thinking about it, but now, with his mind obsessed with waterproofing and insulation, he stopped and paid attention. Tallow, which was simply rendered animal fat, created a barrier that water could not cross. The fat filled the microscopic spaces in the leather, preventing liquid penetration while still allowing the material to breathe enough to prevent moisture buildup from the inside. And critically, fat was an excellent insulator. Every trapper knew that animals survived winter cold because of the fat layers under their skin. Fat trapped heat and prevented its escape. Hiram stood in the rain, holding his possibles bag, and thought through the implications. If tallow could waterproof leather, could it waterproof other materials? If fat provided insulation for animals, could it provide insulation for a cabin? The question seemed almost absurdly simple, but the potential solution they suggested was unprecedented. No one built roofs using animal fat. Tallow was too valuable to waste on construction. It was used for candles, for cooking, for leather treatment, for soap making. Trading posts paid good money for rendered tallow because demand always exceeded supply. Using large quantities of it for something as mundane as a cabin roof would be considered insane. But Hiram was no longer concerned with what was considered normal or reasonable. Temperance was dead because conventional construction was inadequate, and conventional thinking had produced those inadequate results. If he wanted a different outcome, he needed to think differently, even if that meant approaches that seemed wasteful or irrational to others. He walked back to his cabin through the rain, his mind already working through the logistics. How much tallow would he need? What material would he use as the base that the tallow would saturate? How would he apply it? How thick would the layers need to be to achieve genuine waterproofing and insulation? He had no answers yet, but he had a direction, and that was more than he'd had the day before. That evening, he began rendering tallow from the deer and elk fat he had saved from his winter hunting. Standard practice was to render fat in small batches as needed, but Hiram started processing everything he had, boiling the fat in his largest pot until it liquefied and the solid bits floated to the top. He strained the liquid through cloth and poured it into containers to cool and solidify. The process was tedious and filled the cabin with the smell of cooking fat, but by the end of the week, he had 5 pounds of clean, rendered tallow. By late April, Hiram had rendered 43 pounds of tallow, and the process had not gone unnoticed. Ezekiel Stroud stopped by the cabin in early May and found Hiram with 3 pots suspended over fires, boiling down elk fat from a recent hunt. The smell was overwhelming, a thick, greasy odor that clung to everything. Ezekiel watched for a few minutes, then asked what in God's name Hiram was doing with all that fat. When Hiram explained he was planning to use it for roofing material, Ezekiel laughed so hard he had to sit down. The story spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. Within 2 weeks, every trapper and settler within a 30-mile radius had heard about Hiram Cutler's plan to build a roof out of animal fat. The reactions ranged from bewilderment to outright mockery. Eustace Penfield, who ran a small trading operation from a fortified cabin near the river crossing, told Hiram directly that he was wasting valuable trade goods on a fool's experiment. Tallow sold for 12 cents a pound at the St. Louis markets. 40 pounds represented nearly $5, a substantial sum for a trapper. Using it for construction instead of selling it or making candles was economic madness. Ezekiel Stroud was less diplomatic. He started calling Hiram the tallow fool and made sure everyone knew about the crazy widower who thought he could build a roof out of grease. The nickname spread and stuck. When Hiram visited Obadiah Marsh's trading post to purchase supplies in June, he overheard two trappers he didn't know discussing the tallow fool who was supposedly coating his cabin in deer fat. They were laughing, speculating about what would happen when the first warm day came and the whole roof melted and slid off into a puddle. Hiram endured the mockery without responding. He had learned that arguing was pointless. People would believe what they wanted to believe, and words would not convince them otherwise. Only results mattered, and he did not have results yet. He had tallow, now approaching 60 pounds, as he continued rendering fat from every animal he killed or trapped. He had a theory about how waterproofing and insulation could be achieved, but he had not yet built anything, and until he did, the skeptics had every right to question his sanity. Ephraim Parnell was the only person who didn't mock the idea, though he remained skeptical. He visited in late June and asked serious questions about how Hiram planned to apply the tallow and what base material he would use. Hiram explained his thinking, showing Ephraim samples of different materials he had tested by soaking them in melted tallow. Cattail reeds worked well, absorbing the fat deeply and maintaining structural integrity. Long grass bundled tightly also showed promise. Thin strips of bark became completely waterproof when saturated. Ephraim examined the samples, agreed they were genuinely waterproof, but questioned whether the approach would scale to an entire roof and whether it would hold up through a full winter cycle. Those were fair questions that Hiram could not yet answer. Hiram began construction in early July, choosing to build a completely new cabin rather than attempt to modify his existing structure. The location he selected was a quarter-mile from the old cabin, on slightly higher ground, with better drainage and southern exposure that would maximize sunlight during winter months. He spent 3 weeks cutting and preparing logs, building a structure that was smaller than his first cabin, but constructed with more care. The walls went up using standard notching techniques, and he built a simple stone fireplace. This cabin was not about innovation in basic construction. It was about the roof. The base layer was cattail reeds, which grew abundantly along the creek and in the marshy areas near beaver ponds. Hiram had harvested them in late spring when they were mature but still pliable, cutting them at the base and bundling them into sheaves that he dried in the sun for 2 weeks. Cattails were ideal for his purposes because they were hollow, which meant they would absorb tallow deeply, and they were fibrous enough to maintain structure even when saturated. He had harvested enough to create a layer 8 inches thick across the entire roof surface. The roof framework was built using closely spaced rafters, pole logs laid at 12-inch intervals to create a sturdy base. Across these rafters, he laid split planks to form a solid surface that would support the weight of the tallow-soaked materials. This underlayment was critical because it distributed the load and prevented the roof material from sagging between rafters. The planks were fitted tightly but not sealed, allowing for some air movement while providing structural support. Hiram began laying cattails in late July, working in overlapping bundles that he tied to the plank underlayment using cordage made from twisted rawhide. The cattails were arranged like thatch, with each layer overlapping the one below to create a shingled effect that would naturally shed water. He built up the layer gradually, checking frequently to ensure even thickness and proper overlap. The work was tedious and required constant attention to detail, but after 5 days, he had created a uniform 8-inch layer of dried cattails covering the entire roof surface. The tallow application required heat. Hiram built a fire pit outside the cabin and suspended his largest iron pot over it, filling the pot with rendered tallow that he heated until it liquefied completely. The liquid fat was thin and easily poured, almost like water but with a distinctly oily quality. Using a long-handled ladle, he climbed onto the roof and began pouring the hot tallow over the cattails, working in sections and allowing the fat to soak through the layers. The cattails absorbed the tallow readily, darkening as the fat penetrated deep into the fibrous material. The process consumed tallow at an alarming rate. Hiram had expected this, but actually seeing how much fat was required for even a small section of roof was sobering. Each section needed multiple applications to achieve full saturation, and the tallow had to be kept hot to remain liquid enough to pour and penetrate effectively. He worked through his entire supply of rendered fat in 3 days and had covered less than a quarter of the roof surface. Hiram spent the next 6 weeks hunting specifically for fat. He targeted elk and deer, taking animals that showed good body condition and substantial fat deposits. Every pound of fat was carefully preserved, trimmed away from meat and organs, and added to his rendering operation. He built a second fire pit dedicated entirely to rendering, keeping pots boiling almost continuously as he processed the accumulated fat into clean tallow. By mid-September, he had produced an additional 90 pounds of rendered fat, bringing his total to 150 pounds. The amount was staggering by frontier standards, representing dozens of animals and hundreds of hours of work. The tallow application continued through August and into September. Each section of cattail received multiple soakings as Hiram learned through trial and error how much fat was required to achieve complete saturation. The first applications absorbed quickly, the cattails drinking in the tallow like dry earth absorbing rain. Subsequent applications took longer as the material became saturated and the fat began pooling on the surface. Hiram discovered that he could encourage deeper penetration by working the tallow into the cattails with a flat piece of wood, pressing and spreading the fat to force it into areas that gravity alone wouldn't reach. The physics of what he was creating became clear as the work progressed. The tallow was filling every microscopic gap in the cattail fibers, displacing air and creating a continuous fat barrier. Water could not penetrate this barrier because fat and water were fundamentally incompatible. The fat molecules repelled water molecules, causing any liquid that struck the surface to bead up and roll off, rather than soaking in. Additionally, the fat created a flexible seal that could accommodate temperature-driven expansion and contraction without cracking the way hardened clay or dried mud would. The insulation properties were equally important. Fat conducted heat poorly, which was exactly what Hiram needed. The 8-inch layer of tallow-saturated cattails would trap heat inside the cabin by preventing its escape through the roof. Unlike bark or shingles, which allowed heat to pass through easily, the fat barrier would force warmth to stay in the interior space. Animals survived winter specifically because fat layers under their skin prevented body heat from escaping. Hiram was applying the same principle to his cabin, creating an artificial fat layer that would function like a bear's insulating blubber. By late September, the entire roof was saturated with tallow. The surface had transformed from the light tan of dried cattails to a dark brown that was almost black, slick, and slightly reflective when sunlight struck it at certain angles. The smell was distinctly animal, a thick, fatty odor that would fade with time and weathering, but was currently overwhelming. The weight was substantial. Hiram estimated the tallow-soaked layer weighed at least 400 pounds, perhaps more, but the robust rafter and plank system supported it without visible strain. The final step was a top-sealing layer. Hiram applied additional tallow directly to the surface, heating it until it was nearly liquid and spreading it with a flat board to create a smooth coating. This final layer filled any remaining surface irregularities and created a continuous, waterproof skin. Ezekiel Stroud organized what he called an inspection party in early October, bringing 5 other trappers to see Hiram's completed roof. They arrived unannounced, riding up to the new cabin with expressions that mixed curiosity and barely suppressed amusement. Ezekiel dismounted and walked around the structure slowly, examining the dark, greasy-looking roof from all angles. He picked up a long stick and poked at the surface, leaving a small indentation that slowly filled back in as the tallow's natural viscosity restored the surface contour. The other men laughed. Eustace Penfield asked how much tallow Hiram had used. When Hiram answered honestly that he had rendered approximately 150 pounds of fat for the project, Eustace did calculations aloud for everyone's benefit. At 12 cents per pound, Hiram had wasted $18 worth of trade goods on a roof. $18 was more than most trappers earned in an entire season. It was enough money to buy a good horse, or a new rifle, or supplies to last through 2 winters. Using it to coat a cabin in animal grease was financial suicide. Ezekiel wanted to know what would happen when summer came and temperatures rose. Would the whole roof melt and slide off? Would it attract every bear and scavenger within 10 miles, drawn by the smell of fat? Would it go rancid and become unbearable to live near? These were presented as serious questions, but the tone made clear they were rhetorical attacks designed to humiliate. The other trappers added their own concerns. What about fire risk? Wouldn't grease burn more readily than wood? What about insects? Wouldn't flies and beetles swarm to the fat? What about rain? Wouldn't the surface become slippery and dangerous? Hiram answered each question calmly. The tallow would not melt in summer heat because rendered fat had a melting point well above ambient temperatures, remaining solid until heated to at least 100 degrees. Animals would not be attracted because the tallow was pure fat without blood or meat residue that drew scavengers. Rancidity required oxygen exposure, and the thick layer prevented air from reaching the interior fat. Fire risk was minimal because fat did not burn easily without a wick or sustained high heat. Insects were not attracted to pure rendered tallow. Rain would sheet off the waterproof surface without penetrating. The trappers were unimpressed by his reasoning. Ezekiel declared that Hiram had built the most expensive, stupidest roof in the entire Rocky Mountain Territory, and that by spring it would be a failed experiment and a cautionary tale about what happened when grief drove a man to madness. The group rode away laughing, already planning how they would tell the story at the next gathering. The tallow fool had actually done it. He had coated an entire cabin roof in animal grease. It was the funniest thing that had happened in the territory in years. Ephraim Parnell visited alone 2 days later. He climbed onto the cabin roof with Hiram's permission and examined the surface carefully, pressing on it, smelling it, studying how it had been applied. He asked technical questions about the layering process and the amount of tallow used per section. Finally, he asked the only question that mattered: "Do you think it will work?" Hiram moved into the new cabin in mid-October, transferring his supplies and few possessions from the old structure. The interior was smaller than his previous home, just 12 feet by 14 feet, but it felt more solid. The walls were tighter, the fireplace drew better, and the door fit properly in its frame. He built a simple sleeping platform, installed shelves for his provisions, and arranged his trapping equipment along one wall. Everything was functional and spare. He was not building a home in the way he had with Temperance. He was building a shelter designed to test a theory. The first snow came on November 3, 1841, arriving in the early morning hours as a light dusting that gradually intensified through the day. By evening, 4 inches covered the ground, and the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. Hiram sat inside near his fire, listening to the silence that snow brought to the forest. He had built a modest fire, not pushing it hard, using perhaps half the wood he would have burned in his old cabin to maintain the same level of comfort. The interior temperature felt stable in a way his previous cabin had never achieved. He went outside periodically to check the roof. The snow was accumulating evenly across the surface, and critically, it was not melting from underneath. This was important. In his old cabin, heat escaping through the thin bark roof would melt the bottom layer of snow even as more fell on top, creating ice layers that added weight and caused structural problems. The tallow roof was different. The heat was staying inside the cabin where it belonged, and the roof surface remained cold enough that snow simply accumulated without melting. The insulation was working exactly as he had theorized. The snowfall continued for 2 days, eventually leaving 18 inches of accumulation. Hiram monitored the roof constantly, watching for any signs of sagging or structural stress. The rafter and plank system held firm under the combined weight of the tallow-soaked cattails and the heavy snow load. There was no visible deflection, no creaking sound suggesting strain. The roof was bearing the weight easily. On the 3rd day after the snow stopped, the temperature rose slightly and sunlight broke through the clouds. Hiram went outside and saw something that confirmed his design was working better than he had hoped. The snow on his roof was beginning to melt from the top down, warmed by the sun, but the meltwater was not penetrating into the roof material. Instead, it was running off the sloped surface in small rivulets, dripping off the eaves and falling to the ground. The tallow layer was completely waterproof. Not a single drop was making it through to the interior. Inside the cabin, Hiram performed a simple test that would become his standard method for evaluating the roof's performance. He placed a small container of water on the floor in the exact center of the cabin and monitored its temperature over the course of a day. In his old cabin, water left sitting would freeze solid during cold nights, despite a fire burning. In the new cabin, with a modest fire, the water remained liquid. December brought sustained cold that turned the wilderness into a frozen landscape where temperatures regularly dropped below zero. Other trappers hunkered down in their cabins, burning through wood supplies at alarming rates and still shivering under piles of furs. Hiram worked his trap lines in relative comfort, returning each evening to a cabin that required only a moderate fire to maintain warmth that seemed almost luxurious compared to frontier standards. The difference was measurable and profound. Ransom Blackwood stopped by on December 19th, ostensibly to discuss trapline territories, but actually curious about whether Hiram's strange roof was performing as claimed. He arrived in late afternoon, and Hiram invited him inside. Ransom stepped through the door and stopped immediately, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise. The interior was warm, not marginally comfortable, not barely tolerable, but genuinely warm. Warm enough that Hiram was working in a single layer of clothing without furs or heavy wraps. Ransom looked at the fireplace and saw a modest fire burning, nothing exceptional in size or intensity. He looked around the cabin, searching for some other heat source that might explain the temperature. There was none. Just the one fire, and yet the interior felt like a cabin where a roaring blaze had been maintained for hours. He asked directly how much wood Hiram was burning per day. Hiram explained he was using approximately half a cord per week during the coldest weather. Ransom was burning more than that in 3 days to achieve far less warmth. The physical evidence was undeniable. Ransom sat near the fire for 20 minutes, long enough to experience how the cabin held its heat. The warmth was not concentrated near the fireplace the way it was in standard cabins, where you burned on one side and froze on the other. Instead, the temperature was remarkably even throughout the interior space. The tallow roof was trapping heat and preventing its escape, creating an envelope of warmth that persisted even when the fire burned low. Ransom asked permission to check the exterior temperature for comparison. Outside, Ransom's thermometer read 8 degrees. Inside, using a thermometer Hiram had purchased specifically for testing, the temperature was 51 degrees. The difference was 43 degrees. Ransom stood looking at both thermometers, verifying the readings multiple times. In his own cabin, with a larger fire burning, he typically achieved maybe a 25-degree difference between exterior and interior temperatures. Hiram was achieving nearly double that with less fuel. The efficiency was revolutionary. Ransom asked about moisture and condensation, common problems in tightly sealed spaces. Hiram showed him the walls and ceiling, which were dry despite the temperature differential. The tallow roof breathed just enough to prevent condensation buildup while still maintaining its insulating and waterproof properties. This balance was critical because excessive moisture inside a cabin led to rot, mold, and respiratory problems. The roof was performing perfectly, managing both heat retention and vapor transmission. Before leaving, Ransom asked a question that changed the trajectory of how Hiram's innovation would spread. Would Hiram be willing to explain his construction methods to someone who wanted to build a similar roof? Hiram answered without hesitation, yes. He had no interest in keeping secrets or profiting from the technique. If someone wanted to build a tallow roof, he would share everything he had learned. January brought the coldest temperatures of the winter, with multiple days where thermometers dropped to 20 below zero. Hiram's cabin became a subject of intense interest as word spread about its remarkable heat retention. Trappers and settlers who had mocked the tallow roof 6 months earlier were now asking questions and requesting to see the structure for themselves. Ezekiel Stroud remained skeptical, refusing to believe the reports until he could examine the evidence personally. He organized his inspection party for January 23rd, bringing 5 other trappers to see what they still assumed must be exaggerated claims. They arrived to find Hiram outside splitting firewood in temperatures that hovered around 19 degrees. What stopped them immediately was not the cabin itself, but the icicles. Massive formations hung from every edge of the roof, some reaching nearly to the ground, 3 feet long and thick as a man's arm. The icicles were actively dripping despite the freezing temperature, with water running down their length in steady streams that caught the weak winter sunlight. The visual evidence was impossible to dismiss or explain away through skepticism. Ezekiel dismounted and approached the nearest icicle, touching it and feeling the water flowing across the frozen surface. He looked up at the roof, trying to understand what he was seeing. Icicles formed when heat escaped through a roof and melted snow on the exterior surface, but typical frontier cabins did not produce formations like these. The icicles on standard cabins were small and sporadic because heat escaped too quickly and unevenly to create sustained melting. These icicles were enormous and uniform, which meant heat was escaping slowly and consistently through the entire roof surface. Hiram explained the physics without being asked. The interior of the cabin was warm enough that heat conducted slowly through the thick tallow layer and warmed the exterior roof surface. This warmth melted snow and ice that accumulated on the roof, creating meltwater that ran to the eaves and refroze in the cold air, forming icicles. The process was continuous as long as the interior remained warm and exterior temperatures stayed below freezing. The icicles were proof that the insulation was working. Heat was staying inside the cabin long enough to be useful, then escaping so slowly that it created this visible byproduct. Abner Whitlock asked to check the interior temperature. Hiram led the group inside, where the contrast with exterior conditions was immediately apparent. The cabin felt warm, comfortable enough that Hiram had been working without his heavy coat. Abner checked his thermometer, waited for the reading to stabilize, then checked it again. 62 degrees. Outside was 19 degrees. The difference was 43 degrees. Abner asked about the fire size. Hiram showed them the modest fire burning in the fireplace, nothing exceptional. Several of the trappers examined the firewood supply stacked outside, trying to calculate how much fuel Hiram was consuming. The conclusion was inescapable. He was achieving superior warmth with substantially less wood. Eustace Penfield walked around the interior, examining the walls and ceiling for any signs of moisture problems. Everything was dry. He asked about the total cost of the tallow used. Ransom Blackwood returned to Hiram's cabin on February 7th with specific intent. He had spent the weeks since his first visit thinking through the implications of what he had seen, and he had made a decision that would require Hiram's help. His own cabin was inadequate. He knew this before seeing Hiram's tallow roof, but the comparison made the inadequacy impossible to ignore. He was burning through his wood supply at an unsustainable rate, still cold most of the time, and facing the real possibility that he would run out of firewood before spring if the winter lasted as long as the previous years had. He wanted to build a tallow roof, but he needed detailed information about materials, quantities, and techniques. Hiram invited him inside and spent the next 3 hours explaining everything he had learned. The conversation was technical and specific. How many cattail bundles were required per square foot of roof surface? How much tallow was needed to achieve full saturation? What was the optimal thickness for the layer? How should the rafters be spaced to support the weight? What was the best method for applying hot tallow without burning yourself or creating gaps in coverage? Hiram answered every question completely, describing both his successes and his failures. He explained that his first attempts at tallow application had been inefficient, wasting fat because he had not understood how much the cattails would absorb. He described the learning process of getting the tallow temperature correct, hot enough to flow and penetrate, but not so hot that it smoked or degraded. He showed Ransom samples of cattails at different saturation levels, demonstrating what fully saturated material looked like compared to inadequate coverage. The most critical information was the quantity of tallow required. For a cabin similar in size to Ransom's, Hiram estimated 120 to 150 pounds of rendered fat would be needed to build an adequate roof. This represented a substantial investment of time and resources. Ransom would need to hunt specifically for fat-rich animals, process the fat carefully to render it clean, and accumulate the supply over weeks or months. The work would be significant, but Ransom had seen the results and understood the value. He was willing to invest the effort. Hiram also warned him about the mockery he would face. Other trappers would call him a fool, would question his judgment, would predict failure. This was inevitable and should be expected. Ransom acknowledged this, but said he did not care what others thought. He cared about staying warm and conserving his firewood supply. If building a tallow roof accomplished those goals, the opinions of skeptics were irrelevant. Hiram recognized his own thinking reflected in Ransom's words. Problem-solving mattered more than social acceptance. Before Ransom left, Hiram gave him 10 pounds of rendered tallow from his own supply to begin testing application techniques on a small practice section. He also gave him bundles of prepared cattails and suggested Ransom experiment with the saturation process before committing to a full roof. This generosity was characteristic of how Hiram shared his innovation. He was not protecting trade secrets or trying to profit from his knowledge. He was solving a problem that affected everyone who lived in the wilderness. Ransom Blackwood completed his tallow roof in late April of 1842, working alone over a 6-week period. He followed Hiram's instructions closely, rendering fat from his spring hunting and building up the layered structure with methodical care. The work was exactly as difficult and time-consuming as Hiram had warned, but Ransom persisted. By the time he finished, he had created a roof that looked nearly identical to Hiram's, dark and slick, 8 inches thick, smelling of animal fat. Other trappers who saw it shook their heads and made the same jokes they had made about Hiram. Now there were 2 tallow fools. The following winter validated Ransom's investment. His cabin maintained warmth with half the firewood he had previously required, and the interior stayed dry even during heavy snow and rain. He mentioned these results casually to other trappers when they asked, but he did not promote or defend the technique. The performance spoke for itself to anyone willing to pay attention. By spring of 1843, 3 more trappers had built tallow roofs, each working quietly without announcing their intentions until the construction was complete. Abner Whitlock was among these converts. He had watched Hiram's roof perform for more than a year, had verified the temperature measurements himself, and had calculated the firewood savings. The economics were compelling, even accounting for the tallow cost. The time and effort invested in rendering fat and building the roof were recovered within a single winter through reduced wood gathering and improved comfort. Abner built his roof in May of 1843, and it performed exactly as expected when cold weather returned. The spread of the technique was organic and quiet, driven by practical results rather than promotion. Trappers who built tallow roofs rarely advertised what they had done. They simply endured the initial mockery, let their cabins perform through a winter, and answered questions from those who noticed the results. The innovation spread through demonstration rather than persuasion. Men who saw icicles dripping from a cabin roof while snow still covered the ground asked questions. Men who visited a warm cabin heated by a modest fire wanted to know how it was achieved. The answers led to more tallow roofs. Ezekiel Stroud remained unconvinced through 1843 and into 1844, but his resistance was increasingly isolated. By the winter of 1844 to 1845, roughly a dozen cabins within a 30-mile radius of Hiram's original location had tallow roofs in some variation. Some trappers used cattails like Hiram had. Others experimented with long grass, with bundled straw, with strips of bark. The base materials varied, but the principle remained constant. Rendered animal fat applied in thick layers created waterproofing and insulation that far exceeded conventional frontier roofing. The technique also spread geographically as trappers moved to new territories or shared information at trading posts and rendezvous gatherings. By 1846, tallow roofs were being built in areas hundreds of miles from Hiram's original cabin. The innovation had become part of frontier knowledge, passed from experienced trappers to newcomers as practical wisdom rather than revolutionary technique. By 1848, the Rocky Mountain fur trade was collapsing under the weight of depleted beaver populations and changing fashion markets. Silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying the economic foundation that had drawn men into the wilderness. Trappers began leaving the mountains in significant numbers, heading to Oregon, California, or back to settlements in the east. The era of the mountain man was ending, but the cabins remained, scattered across the landscape as evidence of lives lived in brutal isolation. Many of these cabins had tallow roofs. The technique had spread far enough that it was no longer associated specifically with Hiram Cutler. Trappers building new structures simply incorporated tallow roofing as standard practice if they had access to sufficient animal fat. The method had variations based on available materials and individual preferences, but the core principle remained unchanged. Thick layers of organic material saturated with rendered fat created superior waterproofing and insulation compared to any other frontier roofing technique. Settlers moving west discovered abandoned trapper cabins and recognized the quality of tallow roof construction. The roofs remained waterproof and structurally sound years after trappers had left, while conventional bark and shingle roofs had deteriorated into uselessness. Some of these cabins were reoccupied and maintained. Others were studied by settlers who then built their own structures using similar techniques. The knowledge continued spreading, now moving from the trapping community into the broader population of frontier settlers. Hiram himself left the mountains in 1849. He had trapped for 11 years following Temperance's death, accumulating modest savings and a reputation as a competent but solitary figure. He sold his claim, his cabin, and most of his equipment to a young trapper newly arrived from Kentucky. The transaction included a detailed explanation of how the tallow roof was constructed and maintained. The new owner listened carefully, recognizing the value of what he was receiving. The cabin would serve him well for years. Hiram traveled to Oregon Territory, purchased a small piece of land near the Willamette Valley, and began farming. The transition from trapping to agriculture was substantial, requiring him to learn new skills and adapt to a completely different way of life. He was 42 years old and starting over in a region filling rapidly with settlers seeking land under the Donation Land Claim Act. He never married again. He lived alone in a modest farmhouse he built using conventional construction methods. There was no tallow roof. That innovation belonged to the mountains and the specific problems of wilderness survival. He rarely spoke about his years as a trapper. When neighbors asked about his past, he mentioned that he had worked the beaver streams in the Rockies during the trade's final years, but he offered no dramatic stories or colorful anecdotes. He was remembered by those who knew him in Oregon as a quiet, competent farmer who kept to himself and helped neighbors when asked. None of them knew about the roof that had changed frontier construction or the grief that had driven its invention. Hiram Cutler died in 1867 at age 60, buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon. His gravestone listed his name, birth year, and death year. There was no mention of trapping, no reference to innovations in cabin construction, no acknowledgement of the technique that bore his methods, if not his name. To the community that buried him, he was simply a farmer who had lived a quiet life and left no family behind. His estate was modest, consisting of his land, farmhouse, and basic possessions. Everything was sold at auction to settle minor debts. In the mountains where Hiram had trapped, cabins with tallow roofs continued sheltering people through the 1850s and 60s. Some belonged to the few remaining trappers who refused to abandon the wilderness. Others housed prospectors searching for gold and silver in remote creek beds. A few sheltered hunters who supplied game to mining camps and settlements. The roofs required minimal maintenance, occasionally needing additional tallow applied to repair areas damaged by weather or wildlife, but the basic structure remained sound for decades. By the 1870s, when the frontier was rapidly closing and settlement patterns were consolidating, the specific origin of tallow roofing had been forgotten. People in certain regions simply knew that coating thick layers of bundled organic material with rendered animal fat created excellent roofs. The technique was considered local wisdom, part of the collective knowledge that accumulates in any community facing specific environmental challenges. No one remembered Hiram Cutler or the personal tragedy that had driven him to develop the method. Some of his original work survived into the 20th century. A cabin he had built in 1844, sold to another trapper who maintained it carefully, stood until 1923, when a forest fire finally destroyed it. The roof had lasted 79 years with only minor repairs, far exceeding the lifespan of any conventional frontier roof. When the structure burned, the flames had difficulty consuming the tallow-saturated material, which smoldered stubbornly rather than burning quickly. Even in destruction, the roof demonstrated the properties that had made it valuable. The principle Hiram had discovered, that animal fat could provide both waterproofing and insulation when applied correctly to organic materials, was eventually replaced by manufactured materials like tar paper, asphalt shingles, and modern insulation. These industrial products performed similar functions with less labor and more consistency. But for the brief period when the frontier existed beyond reach of manufacturing and supply chains, tallow roofing represented a genuine solution to a life-threatening problem. Men and women stayed warmer, burned less firewood, and survived winters that might otherwise have killed them because someone had observed that water beaded off fat-treated leather and thought carefully about what that simple fact implied. Hiram had not set out to revolutionize frontier construction. He had tried to ensure no one else died the way temperance had died, from preventable cold in an inadequate shelter. The solution he developed was not elegant or sophisticated. It was simply effective, built from materials available to anyone willing to invest the effort. That effectiveness was his legacy, even though his name disappeared from the story.